Tani Adewumi has almost hit a rating of 2,700 in online blitz. Incredible at the age of 11. He's hit a peak of 2671 on chess.com. For the record, his over-the-board rating on the USCF is 2278. The youngest player to ever hit 2,700 over the board was Magnus Carlsen at the age of 16. In this game, one of the first that I'd like to cover of Tani playing blitz against Grandmasters is played against Maxim Lugovskoy, and his online rating is 2694. At the time of this game, Tani's online rating was 2405. Tani has the white pieces, Maxim Lugovskoy has the black pieces. Let's dive right in. This is Chess Dog. My name is John Montgomery. Let's go. Tani begins with e4. His opponent plays the French defense with e6. Tani plays knight to c3, and after d5, d4, we get a mainline French defense. Normally it would go like this, d4, d5, knight to c3, but he plays a slightly different move order. His opponent could have played knight f6, the classical, could have taken and played the Rubinstein. Instead, he plays bishop to b4, the Winnower variation, the sharpest of the French defense variations. Tani gains space with e5, the main line. The Grandmaster attacks the base of the pawn chain with c5, attacking d4. a3, bishop takes knight, check. Pawn takes bishop. And here we see some of the imbalances in the structure. White has the two bishops and space, but black has a really solid pawn structure, and there are some weaknesses on c3 and c2 that the Grandmaster can work on later in the game. Knight to e7, queen to g4. Tani plays the main line, going right after that g7 pawn that's been weakened because the dark square bishop traded itself off for the knight. Normally that bishop would defend that pawn. Queen to c7. The Grandmaster offers the poisoned pawn variation of the Winnower, a sharp line where black really goes after white's king, but gives some long-term advantages to white as well. So in this game, Tani is sort of trying to keep his positional advantages, but also keep his king safe. He goes ahead and takes the pawn, queen g7, rook g8, queen h7, cd4. Now the queen is threatening to take on c3 with check, hitting the king and the rook. So Tani defends with knight to e2 to cover that c3 square. Knight b to c6, and he plays f4, the main move. If he played something that looks natural to the eye, like say pawn takes pawn, then black would actually take on d4 with the knight. And if the knight recaptures, boom, the queen can still go to c3 and double attack the king and the rook. So you want to avoid that. So he defends the e5 pawn with f4 instead, dc3, and queen to d3. And this is sort of the official starting position of the main line Winnower poison pawn variation. And the main line played these days is usually the move d4. And it seems black can hold this position and do okay. The problem is there are a number of lines where white can force a drawish position where black has to play a series of accurate moves without much chance of winning. So the Grandmaster decides to play the older move that keeps a lot of tension in the position and is a little more dangerous for white, although it's more dangerous for black as well. He plays the move bishop to d7. And Anish Giri offers this as an alternative in his chessable course that he has on the French Winnower. The knight takes the pawn. It threatens to go into the b5 square here, which would attack the queen and threaten check on d6. So black plays a6 to control that square and keep the knight out. Rook to b1. This sets up a little trap. If black were to play the natural move, queenside castling, then white would have a winning position after this shocker. Queen takes a6. Looks like it's just giving up the queen, but because of the placement of that rook after pawn takes queen, bishop takes pawn, check, and the king has nowhere to go. And black's only option is to actually block with his own queen. After takes, comes back, and then the threatening rook to b7, the game would essentially be over. White would just be completely winning. So instead of castling long, plays rook to c8, piling up on this c-file with the weak knight on c3 and the c2 pawn. h4. In this position, white's main trumps are the two bishops and this passed h-pawn. So Tani wants to advance that h-pawn up the board as fast as he possibly can while keeping his king safe. Now his opponent, the Grandmaster, plays knight to a5. The main move here, probably the better move, this was Geary's recommendation, is the immediate knight to f5. Knight to a5 isn't quite as strong, and here, of course, he's attacking this knight on c3. Tani plays the most accurate move. He plays rook to h3, defending that knight laterally. The queen and the rook defend the knight against the attack of black's queen and rook on the c-file. Now the knight comes into f5 and h5. Advance this pawn as fast as he can because he wants to distract the Grandmaster's pieces. The Grandmaster wants to go after white's king, which is in the middle of the board, but he wants to keep him distracted with that h-pawn so he can't get the attacking material he needs. Knight to c4, h6, queen to a5, which pins the knight at c3 or threatens a possible d4, taking advantage of that pinned knight. Tani plays h7, which hits the rook at g8, forcing him to respond with the rook to h8. g4, continuing to advance those kingside pawns, and importantly, kicking the knight at f5 away from its very nice post. The knight goes back to e7, and now he takes care of that pin with the bishop to d2. The Grandmaster grabs the bishop, so now at the very least, white doesn't have the two bishops anymore. Queen takes, and knight to g6. Now at this point, white is just better. His attack has not yet materialized, yet Tani's long-term asset of the h-pawn is a real problem for black. Perhaps a move like b5 would have been the best option to limit the scope of that rook at b1. He plays knight to g6, and Tani says, well, you know, I can just take that b7 pawn. I think my king is safe enough that I can grab the material, and that's what he does. He takes the pawn at b7. The Grandmaster plays queen to a3. A better move might have been knight to f8 to pile onto that h7 pawn to capture it with the knight and the rook hitting it. He takes the queen at the queen takes the pawn at a3 instead. Now knight to e4. This is an amazing move. Knight to e4. The knight cannot be taken because then the queen would take the bishop at d7 with check, followed by mate at f7. Also, the rook at h3 is unveiled against the queen at a3, so this threatens a lot of things. It also threatens the knight to d6 check, forking the king and queen. It's a devastating move. Queen to a1 check, king to f2, and now, of course, the knight is threatening to hop into d6 with the fork. So the Grandmaster plays rook to d8 to evade that, but it doesn't save anything. Knight to f6 check. Now this wins a piece. If he plays king to e7, trying to stay in contact with that bishop to save it, boom, queen to b4, checkmate on the spot. So he cannot protect that bishop. He instead has to play king to f8, knight takes d7, check. Now, he takes back with the rook, giving up even more material. We may ask, why didn't he just move his king away? This begins... We're going to see so many mating patterns emerge in this game from this point forward. It really can make your head spin. Well, let's take a look. If he plays, say, king to e7, then queen to b4 check, just as before. King e8, knight to f6, checkmate. What if he plays king to e8? Knight f6 check, king f8, queen to b4 check, king to g7. Well, now, knight to h5 check. He can play king h6, but then he hits it, forcing king takes pawn, then rook f7 check, and then rook to g7 is mate. The queen controls the f8 square. That would be it. Well, what if finally he decides to go to g7? Then f5 opens up the queen at d2 to enter into that h6 square supported by the rook at h3. If rook h7 takes fg6 check, king g6, knight to f8 check. If king goes back to g7, queen g5, king f8, queen to e7, boom, boom, and mate. And after knight f8, if he takes here, boom, same story. Same sad story. And that would be curtains. So he has to give up the rook for the knight, which he does. Rook takes d7. King g7, now f5. The queen threatening to come into h6. The queen takes at e5. Now queen to h6 check, king to f6, g5 check, king takes, pawn, bishop to d3 check. Now, if you put this in your engine, it shows one mating pattern after another. It really is all about finding the pattern, which he does. King to f4, rook f3 check. An actual faster mate here is rook to h4 check. And then when the knight takes the rook, actually queen takes knight is just checkmate. So he could have made it even faster there. Rook to f3 check, king g4, queen h3 check, king g5, taking the f7 pawn with the other rook. And now basically he has to just get out of the checks that black can have with his queen, and then he'll just be completely winning. Take, check, 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 king e2, queen to e5 check, rook e3, knight to f4 check. That forks the king and the queen, so he has to give up the exchange for it, but that's not a problem. Queen f4, queen to e6. Now, queen h2 check. This is a series of checks. The Grandmaster checks him for a number of moves, just awaiting the final mating pattern. King to e1, queen h1, blocks with the bishop, queen to h4 check, king to d2, queen to b4, king d1, queen b1 check, boom, 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 boom. King e1, queen to b4, king f2, queen to h4, and king to g2. And now there are no more checks that just don't lead to an immediate loss of the queen. For example, if queen to g4 check, he would just play rook to g3, which pins the queen. Rook to h7, and now it's mate in 2 from here. Can you see it? That's it. Rook to e5 check, king to f4, queen to f5, mate. A really well-played game from Tani. Now, these are blitz games. Obviously, there are some mistakes from both sides. That's normal, but his opponent here is a Grandmaster, and he's won quite a few games against Grandmasters in blitz, and I look forward to covering some of those in the future. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon. Bye.